The developer's attorney called just after sunrise on Monday, his tone stripped down to one blunt line. We have a problem. For 14 years, the man had built shopping plazas, housing tracts, and commercial complexes, never once rattled by setbacks. But this time the strain was obvious. A $30 million development had come to a complete halt. Halted by what? A narrow strip of land, just 12 feet wide and stretching half a mile. There was a pause before the next question. Who owns it? A farmer. And how much does he want? He hasn't returned the call. Then came the detail that made no sense to anyone listening. That farmer had purchased the land back in 2001 for only $8,000. Now an entire multi-million-dollar project sat frozen because of those 12 feet, and because of one patient man who had waited 23 years for this moment. His name was Gerald Marsh, and the story really began at a quiet bank auction almost no one bothered to attend. March 2001, Callaway County Bank, where a simple folding table stood in as the auction desk, while 4 locals lingered near a coffee pot just to watch. The bank was liquidating foreclosed properties, and when the auctioneer announced the next listing, he read it without much interest. Parcel 7C, 12 feet wide, half a mile long. Opening bid $5,000. No one reacted. He gave a half smile and repeated it. $5,000 for half a mile of grass. Anyone? A hand finally lifted from the back of the room. A man in a clean shirt and worn work boots. 62-year-old Gerald Marsh. $5,000 to the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer confirmed. Then another voice cut in from near the coffee pot. 6. The bid moved. 6,000. The auctioneer nodded, looking for 7. Gerald didn't even glance up, just answered calmly. 8. Heads turned across the room, and just before the gavel could drop, the branch manager, Curtis Wade, laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. 8,000 for a 12-foot strip of nothing. He stared directly at Gerald and added, "Some people just collect problems." A few chuckles followed, but Gerald remained silent, signed the paperwork, folded his receipt, and slipped it into his coat, because unlike anyone else in that room, he fully understood what he had just secured. To see why Gerald Marsh was willing to pay $8,000 for that thin strip of land, you have to step back to 1999, not to a courtroom or a bank, but to the Callaway County Public Library. Gerald had a routine few people understood, making a monthly trip to study county records that most ignored, digging through old zoning maps, road surveys, easement documents, and long-forgotten infrastructure plans. His wife Margaret teased that it was homework, but Gerald called it paying attention. Then one evening in October 1999, he came across something that made him pause mid-page. It was a proposal from 1956 to widen State Route 9, requiring a narrow 12-foot corridor along the eastern boundary. The expansion had been abandoned in 1961, yet one critical detail had never been resolved. The corridor was never officially dissolved. On paper, it still existed as its own parcel, forgotten but legally alive. Gerald reread the record 3 times, went home, and sketched the layout by hand at his kitchen table, mapping Route 9, the corridor, and the surrounding land. On one side lay scattered farmland, but on the other stretched hundreds of acres of flat, undeveloped ground, cheap and unnoticed, the kind of land developers eventually target before anyone else catches on. He studied that map for a long while before picking up the phone and calling his neighbor Dale, asking if he remembered the empty land east of Route 9. Dale replied casually, "Nothing out there," and Gerald answered after a pause, "Not yet." Over the next 18 months, Gerald watched quietly and patiently, noting every detail each time he drove past, from survey markers to tire tracks to newly placed fence posts. Then in early 2000, a survey crew arrived, 2 trucks working for 2 full days without explanation. 3 months later, 40 acres were sold under an LLC tied to a Nashville address, followed by another 60 acres half a year later, and then more parcels after that. Gerald tracked every transaction in a notebook Margaret had given him, and when she eventually asked what he was recording, he simply said, "A pattern." When she pressed further, he replied, "The kind that only reveals itself with time." By the summer of 2001, nearly 280 acres had been quietly assembled by a single company. Gerald traced the LLC back to a developer known as Meridian Land Group, and then confirmed the crucial piece of the puzzle. The assembled land had no functional road access, Wetlands blocked the south, private holdings cut off the west, and the north offered no practical entry point. The only legal route in or out followed the eastern side of Route 9, running directly through that same 12-foot corridor the bank was about to auction. When the bidding opened at $5,000, Gerald had already calculated everything. The developer had spent millions securing the surrounding land, but still didn't control the one strip that made it usable. So he set his ceiling at $8,000, just enough to win without drawing attention. Sure, he had arrived ahead of everyone else. Gerald made his way back from the auction, the deed tucked neatly inside his shirt pocket. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, watching the door. Did you get it? It's ours now. And what comes next? Gerald paused briefly. Now we wait. Margaret had spent 38 years with him, long enough to recognize the difference between doubt and conviction. This time, he was certain. How long? She asked. As long as it takes. She gave a single nod, rose from her chair, and quietly set the kettle to boil. For years, that narrow piece of land was hardly ever mentioned again. Gerald looked after it the same way he handled everything in his life, methodical, quiet, and without drawing attention. Twice a year he cut the grass, and every single year he paid the $47 in taxes right on time. He made sure the boundary markers stayed visible. To anyone passing by, it was just a 12-foot strip of grass along Route 9. But to Gerald, it was something unresolved. Then one day, the first offer arrived. In 2008, a neatly dressed young real estate agent from Nashville came knocking. Smooth and confident, he offered $80,000 for Parcel 7C, 10 times what Gerald had originally paid. Most people wouldn't hesitate. Gerald simply gave a polite smile and said he wasn't interested. The agent pushed, hinting the offer could climb higher. I'm sure it could, Gerald replied calmly, before closing the door. Margaret had overheard it all. $80,000? She asked. Gerald nodded. That's a lot of money. It is. And you still said no? I did. She studied him briefly, then returned to the kitchen, never bringing it up again. Time moved on. Eventually, the county itself reached out, offering $120,000. Gerald thanked them and declined. May I ask why? The commissioner questioned. Because it isn't time yet, Gerald answered. Time for what? There was no reply. Years later, in 2016, Meridian Land Group showed up in person, not an agent this time, but a lawyer in a sharp suit carrying a leather briefcase. He put $250,000 on the table. Gerald welcomed him in, poured coffee, listened closely, then met his gaze over the rim of his cup. Tell your client I've been patient too, longer than he has. The lawyer left with nothing changed. Gerald opened his notebook, recorded the date, the offer, and wrote 3 simple words, not yet. Wait. From 2001 to 2024, offer after offer came and went, and Gerald refused every one. Not out of stubbornness, and not because he was wealthy, but because he understood something others didn't. The strip wasn't worth what they were offering. It was worth what they would eventually need. And by 2024, they needed it. That spring, Meridian Land Group filed for final approval on a massive project, 340 acres east of Route 9, a mix of retail and housing nearly a decade in the making. The town saw growth and opportunity. Gerald saw documents. He drove to the county planning office and requested the permit file, and the clerk handed him a thick stack of papers. A heavy bundle of documents. Gerald was after just one sheet, page 31, the site access layout, road dimensions, traffic direction, entry points, and there it was. The primary access road for the entire development stretched along the eastern side of Route 9, cutting directly through Parcel 7C, 12 feet wide, nearly half a mile in length, Gerald's property. He folded the papers neatly and headed home. That evening, he phoned his daughter, Sandra. Sandra was 41, a real estate attorney in Knoxville, sharp, composed, steady under pressure. Dad, what is it? I need you to review something. What kind of thing? A permit filing. There was a brief pause. Parcel 7C. Gerald smiled faintly. You remember. You showed it to me when I was 12, she said. You told me one day it would matter. Gerald gazed out the window. That day has come. Sandra drove down that weekend. She laid the permit documents across the kitchen table. Next to them was the original 2001 deed. Beside that, Gerald's notebook, 23 years of dates, offers, names, figures. She read quietly, then looked up. Dad, their entire access road crosses your land. I know. They can't build without it. I know. Do they realize you own it? Gerald leaned back in his chair. They're about to. 3 weeks later, Meridian faced its first setback. County planners flagged the entrance road. Legal proof of access was required before approval. Meridian assumed it was routine. Their attorneys started tracking Parcel 7C. It took 4 days. 4 days to discover what Gerald had known for 23 years. The call came Thursday morning. Gerald was sipping coffee when his phone rang. An unknown Nashville number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. Mr. Marsh, my name is Robert Hale. I represent Meridian Land Group. I'd like to talk about purchasing your parcel. Gerald stayed silent. We're ready to offer $400,000. Cash, closing within 30 days. Gerald set his cup down. For $100,000 for land he had bought for $8,000. He finally spoke. I appreciate the call. Hale sounded relieved. So, you'll consider it? Gerald remained steady. It means I appreciate the call. Then he ended the call. He contacted Sandra right away. They put $400,000 on the table. What did you tell them? I ended the call. Sandra paused briefly, then asked a single question. What do you actually want? Gerald gazed out across the land toward the strip he had maintained for 23 years. I don't want to sell it. Then what is it you want? I want its true worth, not what they're offering. What it's worth to them. Sandra drew a steady breath. Then I need to place a call. And Meridian Land Group was about to discover the gap between price and value. Sandra Marsh had been practicing property law for 16 years. She reached out to Robert Hale the next morning. I'm representing Gerald Marsh regarding Parcel 7C. Hale's tone was assured. $400,000 is a generous offer. Sandra remained composed. Then open your permit file. Page 31. Your client's only access road crosses my father's land. That parcel holds the exact value you need. My father will not sell. Hale let out a sigh. Everyone has a price. He wants terms, Sandra replied. What kind of terms? A permanent easement. For $1,500 a month. Adjusted for inflation. Transferable to his heirs. Silence followed. Meridian vanished for 11 days. Then Hale called again. $3,000 a month, 10-year term. Sandra called Gerald. He listened, then spoke 3 words. Tell him no. She called Hale back. For $1,500 permanent. Final. 2 weeks later, Meridian filed a legal challenge. They argued Parcel 7C had been abandoned years ago. Sandra spread county tax records across her desk. Every year from 1961 to 2024, Parcel 7C had been taxed as separate land. 63 consecutive years. She looked at Gerald. They taxed it. They recognized it. They just ruined their own case. Gerald reached into his jacket pocket and placed one folded document on the desk. The original 1961 county resolution. Sandra stared at him. You kept this. Gerald nodded. Since 1999. 23 years. He had been carrying the answer the entire time, and now Meridian would have to face it. The hearing was brief. Meridian's lawyer argued abandonment. Sandra placed 3 documents on the table, the 1956 easement filing, the 1961 county resolution, and 63 years of tax records proving Parcel 7C as separate land. Then she said only one thing. You cannot abandon something the county has taxed for 63 years. The judge reviewed the records, then looked at Meridian's lawyer. Do you dispute these assessments? He hesitated. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Then Parcel 7C remains valid. The claim is denied. Case closed. Meridian called Sandra that same afternoon. Robert Hale sounded different now, less confident, more urgent. Our client will accept your father's terms. Sandra stayed calm. $4,500 a month. Permanent easement adjusted for inflation. Transferable to his heirs. Yes, Hale said. We agree. Sandra called Gerald. They accepted. He stayed quiet for a moment. Every term. Every term. Another pause. Then Gerald said 2 words. 47 what? My yearly taxes, $47 a year for 23 years, now worth $54,000 every year. 3 weeks later, the agreement was signed. Gerald filed it himself at the county clerk's office. Then he returned to his truck, opened the old notebook Margaret had given him years earlier. He turned to the final page and wrote one line. April 2024. Done. Curtis Wade, the bank manager who laughed in 2001, read about the agreement in the local paper. He did not laugh this time. Gerald never knew and never would have cared. Gerald Marsh paid $8,000 for 12 feet of grass. 23 years later, it paid him back every single month for the rest of his life. He never bragged, never called the bank, never needed to. Some men collect problems. Gerald collected patience. If you respect men who think ahead, stay quiet, and win in the end. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments. Would you have taken the $400,000 or waited for the monthly deal? I'll see you next story.